It had been a quiet afternoon, the kind you don't get too often anymore, the kind where the sunlight seemed softer, where the breeze carried the sound of leaves brushing against one another like whispers of old neighbors exchanging stories across their fences. I was on my porch, rocking back and forth on the swing I'd built years ago with my father's hammer, still stained with rust and memory. My wife, Ellen, was inside, humming in the kitchen while stirring a pot of chicken soup. We'd moved into that community thinking it would be a place of peace, a retirement chapter, a stretch of life where we could breathe a little easier, maybe teach the grandkids how to fish in the nearby pond, and host Sunday suppers without worry. But peace is often a fragile thing, especially when there's always one person who believes their authority outweighs everyone else's dignity. That person was Karen. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed watchdog of our HOA, the kind of woman who wielded her clipboard like a sword and her sharp tongue like a whip. She had rules for every little thing, rules she bent for herself but enforced with an iron hand on others. My grass was too long. Ellen's garden gnomes weren't aesthetic. Our porch light was too bright. Our car parked a hair outside the white line. None of it mattered to anyone but her, yet to her it was life or death. Still, we tolerated her, like you do with a summer storm that rolls through every few days, loud, inconvenient, but over quickly enough, until the day she showed up with a key. It was around 3 p.m. when I first noticed her in the driveway, fumbling with something metallic in her hand. At first, I thought she'd locked herself out of her own place again. She had a reputation for carelessness, once calling the fire department because she'd locked her cat in the garage. But no, she wasn't standing at her house. She was standing at mine. I set down my glass of iced tea and squinted. She was at my front door, crouched slightly, sliding a key into my lock. My heart thudded once hard. "Ellen," I called inside, my voice tight. "Come here." By the time Ellen stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a towel, Karen had jiggled the key 3 times, muttering under her breath. The lock, thank heavens, didn't budge. "What on earth are you doing?" I asked, my voice louder now, carrying across the yard. She spun around, her face flushed, her hair frizzing from the humidity. "What does it look like?" "I'm checking the lock. HOA business." "That's my house, Karen." "Correction," she snapped, straightening herself. "This house is under HOA jurisdiction, and I have the master key." Ellen's voice cut like a whip. "No, you do not. There's no such thing as an HOA master key. You're trespassing." Karen's lips twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. She lifted the key and shook it at us like it was proof of her power. "Don't argue. I was told this key opens every door in the neighborhood. Safety checks. Security. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" I repeated, incredulous. "For breaking into my home?" Before the tension could explode, the lock defeated her again, and Karen's face went from smug to scarlet. She kicked the door, lightly with her heel. "Ridiculous. Cheap lock. Doesn't even work with the master key. I'm calling the cops." Ellen gasped, half in outrage, half in disbelief. "You tried to break in, and now you're calling the police on us?" "You're hiding something," Karen shot back, eyes flashing. "Nobody resists HOA inspection unless they're guilty. I'll get the police here, and we'll see who's really in charge." She stormed back down the driveway, fumbling with her phone as if summoning reinforcements to a battle she had already lost. Ellen and I exchanged a glance, equal part exasperation and resignation. "She's lost her mind," Ellen whispered, "or she's desperate for attention." I replied softly, "Either way, it's not about us. It's about her." 15 minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the afternoon calm. 2 squad cars rolled up, dust kicking behind them. Karen was already at the curb, flailing her arms wildly, pointing at our house like it was the scene of a crime. "There they are," she cried. "They locked me out of my own home. This is my house. I live here, and they're refusing to let me in." The officers, 2 young men, maybe in their early 30s, exchanged a glance that said they'd seen this sort of circus before. One of them approached us calmly, while the other stayed back to speak with Karen. "Afternoon, folks," the first officer said, polite but wary. "Mind if I ask what's going on here?" Gladly, I said. Our neighbor here tried to use some so-called master key to break into our home. When it didn't work, she called you claiming she lives here, which she doesn't. We've owned this home for 12 years. She lives across the street, 2 doors down, number 14. Ellen nodded vigorously. We have our deed, our ID, anything you need to prove it. The officer gave a small, weary smile, like a teacher dealing with schoolyard drama. All right, let me just check in with her. From across the lawn, we heard Karen's shrill voice. They're liars. They're squatters. I've been telling the HOA for months these people don't belong here. That's why the master key doesn't work. They must have changed the lock without authorization. The second officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Ma'am, there's no such thing as an HOA master key. Karen's face twisted. Yes, there is. I have it. Look. She thrust the key toward him, her hands shaking with rage. This is proof. Proof of authority. What happened next was a sort of irony you couldn't script. In her fury, Karen jerked the key so hard that it slipped from her fingers. She lunged to grab it, tripped on the curb, and fell forward, straight into the second officer. Before she could scramble up, her hands had tangled in his utility belt. Somehow, in her flailing, she managed to catch her own wrist in his open handcuffs. The click was unmistakable. She froze, staring at her cuffed wrist in horror. I live here, she screamed wild-eyed, tugging against the steel. Do you hear me? I live here. The neighbors had begun to gather by then, drawn by the sirens and the shouting. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd, half disbelief, half amusement. People whispered, shook their heads, and some even laughed quietly behind their hands. The first officer sighed deeply, kneeling to free her. Ma'am, you don't live here. You need to calm down before you hurt yourself. I'm the president of this neighborhood, she shrieked, though it wasn't true. I decide who lives here. I decide who belongs. And there it was, the heart of the matter, plain as day. Not about safety, not about keys, not about rules. It was about control. Ellen slipped her hand into mine, her palm warm despite the coolness of the evening breeze. I felt her squeeze, firm, steady, grounding. In that moment, with the scene unfolding before us, I realized how easy it is for people to lose themselves chasing the illusion of authority, forgetting the humanity of their neighbors. Karen kept struggling, cuffed half by accident, half by her own stubbornness, screaming, I live here, as though repeating it would make it true. But the truth doesn't bend to voices raised in anger. It just waits, steady and unshaken, for the storm to pass. The officer finally managed to unclip Karen's wrist, though not without a struggle. She jerked away, red-faced and panting, clutching her arm as though she'd been wronged by some great injustice. The crowd that had gathered looked on with a mix of pity and irritation. I could see Mrs. Delgado from next door shaking her head slowly, muttering something in Spanish about drama every week. The younger officer turned to me and Ellen. Do you mind if I step inside just to verify your paperwork? Standard procedure. Of course, Ellen said at once, already reaching for the folder we kept in a drawer near the entryway. We'd always been the sort of people who kept our affairs neat, ready, orderly, perhaps because we'd lived long enough to see what happens when you don't. As the officer walked through our living room, he paused, looking at the family photos along the wall, pictures of us with our children on birthdays, graduations, and one of me in uniform decades ago, standing proud beside my father before he passed. The officer's expression softened. He turned back to us with a small nod, as though he no longer needed to see any paperwork at all. But Ellen, never one to leave a stone unturned, placed the deed and our IDs neatly on the table. He glanced at them, nodded again, and said, Everything checks out. No question. This is your home. Outside, Karen's voice was still carrying across the lawn, though it was starting to lose its sharp edge, drifting into something shriller, more desperate. You don't understand. They're fakes. Con artists. They've been here too long. I know what I'm talking about. The second officer, weary now, pinched the bridge of his nose. Ma'am, I confirmed her ownership. This isn't your house. You need to calm down. But Karen wasn't built for calm. She was built for control, and without it, She spiraled. She stomped her foot like a child, eyes wild, hair sticking to her damp forehead. If the master key doesn't work, it's because they tampered with the locks. They should be arrested. The word arrested hung in the air like smoke. A few neighbors actually chuckled, unable to believe what they were hearing. Ellen whispered to me, her voice low, "She's unraveling. This isn't about us anymore. This is her losing her grip." I nodded. My chest ached, not with anger, but with something heavier. Pity, maybe? It struck me that some people cling so hard to authority, to rules, to titles, that when reality refuses to bend, they collapse under the weight of their own need. The officers eventually guided Karen back to the curb, speaking softly, but firm enough to keep her from lunging at our door again. They didn't cuff her, though she'd nearly cuffed herself already. They just stood there, one on either side, like bookends trying to hold in the chaos between them. That's when Mr. Jenkins, the oldest man in our neighborhood, stepped forward. He leaned on his cane, his weathered face calm, wise, and filled with the kind of authority no title could grant. "Karen," he said gently, his voice raspy with age but steady, "I've lived on this street 40 years. I saw the first families move in, saw children grow, saw neighbors bury loved ones and bring new ones into the world. I've seen a lot, and I've seen you, too, always fighting, always shouting, always trying to run things your way. But this here? This isn't leadership. This isn't community. This is you tear yourself apart because you don't know how to let people live." Karen stared at him, stunned silent for a moment. The weight of his words seemed to hang heavier than anything the officers or Ellen or I could have said. But then her face hardened again and she snapped, "You're all against me, every last one of you." Mr. Jenkins sighed. "No, Karen, we were never against you. You've just never been for anyone else." The silence that followed was louder than her shouting had been. The officers finally decided enough was enough. They told her calmly that if she didn't return to her home and stay out of ours, she'd face charges of trespassing and disorderly conduct. She sputtered, raged, muttered threats under her breath. But at last, she stormed off, her heels clicking hard against the pavement, as though each step was a hammer driving in her fury. The crowd dispersed slowly, neighbors whispering to each other as they returned to their homes. A few gave us sympathetic looks. One woman, Mrs. Brown from 2 streets over, touched my arm as she passed. "You too handle that with grace. Don't let her steal your peace." Ellen smiled politely, though I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. When the last of the squad cars pulled away, and the evening returned to its natural quiet, we sank into our porch chairs like deflated balloons. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The crickets began their nightly chorus, and the sky shifted into the lavender hues of twilight. Finally, Ellen broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, "I almost feel sorry for her. Almost." I teased gently, though I understood. "She's lonely," Ellen continued. "She lashes out because she doesn't know how to connect. It's sad, really. People who can't build bridges start building walls. And then they wonder why no one comes around." I thought about that for a while. She was right. Karen had no close friends in the neighborhood. No one dropping by for coffee. No children visiting her on holidays. She'd chosen control over connection. And control is a cruel companion. But pity only goes so far. Because at the end of the day, we still had to live with the fact that she had tried to force her way into our home, that she had dragged the police into our lives, that she had shouted, "I live here," as though words alone could rewrite reality. Later that week, we received a letter from the HOA board. Not an apology, not a statement. Just a bland reminder of community guidelines and a note that some members have expressed concerns about property security. It was bureaucratic nonsense, the kind that dodges responsibility, while pretending to address it. But something unexpected happened. Over the next few days, neighbors began stopping by. People we barely spoke to before brought over pies, casseroles, little gestures of kindness. They weren't there for Karen's drama. They were there for us, to let us know we weren't alone. And in that, there was a lesson. Karen thought she could control the neighborhood by force, by rules, by waving around a master key that was nothing more than an old, rusted skeleton key from some antique shop. But real influence, real leadership, wasn't the shouting or the threats. It was in kindness, in trust, in breaking bread together. One evening, as Ellen and I sat on the porch again, watching the sun set over the roofs of our little street, she took my hand and said, "Maybe this was a blessing." "How so?" I asked, because it reminded us what really matters. Not the HOA, not the rules, not the drama. What matters is knowing we're surrounded by people who care, that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. I squeezed her hand, grateful for her clarity. She was right again, as she often was. Karen's storm had passed, though we knew it might return someday. But storms don't last forever, and when they pass, what remains is what was rooted deep all along. For us, that was love, community, and the quiet strength of knowing that truth, no matter how loudly it's shouted against, always stands firm. The days after the incident took on a strange rhythm. Life returned to its ordinary pace in most ways. Ellen tending her garden, me tinkering in the garage, neighbors walking their dogs or jogging their usual routes. But there was a new undercurrent of quiet conversations and sideways glances whenever Karen stepped outside. She carried herself differently now, though not softer. If anything, she seemed more brittle, her shoulders tight, her steps sharp. She'd glance around as if expecting people to challenge her, but when no one did, she scowled and hurried along. The bravado was still there, but the neighborhood's patience had thinned, and you could feel in the air like humidity before a storm. One morning, as I walked to the mailbox, Mr. Jenkins was already there, leaning on his cane as usual. He greeted me with a nod, his eyes twinkling with that mix of wisdom and humor he carried like armor. "You handled yourself well the other day," he said. "Better than I would have when I was your age." I chuckled. "I don't know about that. I just tried not to let my temper get the better of me." "That's the trick of it," he replied, tapping his cane on the pavement. "Folks like her feed on reactions. You give them fire, they give you a blaze. But you give them calm," he paused, letting the breeze fill the silence. "Well, calm is a mirror. Shows people their own reflection. And sometimes they don't like what they see." His words settled into me, deep as roots. I thought back to Karen's face when she screamed, "I live here." How desperate and wild it looked. Maybe Mr. Jenkins was right. Maybe she didn't like the reflection she saw in our calm. Later that week, I was working the yard when I noticed Ellen across the fence, speaking quietly with Mrs. Brown. They were leaning close, voices low, but I caught enough to understand. Karen had started slipping notes under doors. Not polite notes, not apologies. Accusations. Claims that certain families weren't real residents, that others were in violation of HOA standards, even though half the things she listed weren't rules at all. It was as if she were trying to rebuild her crumbling authority with scraps of paper and paranoia. Ellen came inside afterward, her brow furrowed. She set the stack of vegetables she'd harvested on the counter and sighed. "She's unraveling further." I nodded, wiping the dirt from my hands. "The question is, do we intervene? Or do we just let her burn out on her own?" Ellen looked thoughtful. Intervention's a tricky thing. You can't save someone who doesn't want saving. But ignoring them, well, sometimes that feels like giving permission. That night, over bowls of soup, we talked about it at length. About how easy it is, as people get older, to cling too tightly to the little control they feel they still have. Maybe that's what Karen was doing. Clinging to rules, to imaginary authority, because she was afraid of becoming irrelevant, afraid of being forgotten. "Control," Ellen said softly, "is just fear in disguise." Her words reminded me of something my father once told me, years ago when I was young and headstrong. He said, "Son, you can either rule your neighbors or you can love them, but you can't do both." And here we were, decades later, seeing that truth played out in front of us like a lesson scripted by time itself. A few evenings later, the neighborhood gathered in Jenkins' yard for what had started as a casual cookout, but felt more like a quiet act of solidarity. People brought food, folding chairs, and stories. Children chased each other through grass, while older folks swapped recipes and memories. Ellen and I brought a peach cobbler, still warm from the oven. When we sat on the table, Mrs. Delgado patted Ellen's hand. See? This is what neighborhood means. Sharing, laughing, being together. Not clipboards and shouting. We all chuckled, but her words held weight. Halfway through the evening, Karen appeared. She stood at the edge of the yard, her arms crossed, her face pale under the dim glow of the porch lights. She didn't come closer, didn't greet anyone, just hovered, like a ghost unwilling to join the living. The laughter dimmed for a moment when people noticed her, but no one invited her over, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. After years of her battles, people no longer had the strength to pretend. She lingered for a while, her eyes darting from one group to another. Then, with a sharp turn, she walked away, her figure swallowed by the dark. I watched her go, a pang tugging at my chest. Ellen noticed. "You're feeling sorry for her again," she whispered. "Maybe," I admitted, "but it's hard not to. Loneliness is its own kind of prison." Ellen squeezed my hand. "Yes, but she built the bars herself." Her words settled heavy in me. True, and yet the weeks stretched into months. Karen's outbursts became less frequent, though when they came, they burned hot. But the neighborhood had changed since that day with the police. People were closer now, kinder, more willing to check in on each other, to share burdens, to laugh together. Sometimes life works in strange ways. A storm that threatens to tear things apart ends up binding them closer. One late afternoon, as autumn painted the trees gold and crimson, Ellen and I sat on the porch sipping coffee. A group of kids rode their bikes past, their laughter echoing down the street. Across the way, Mrs. Brown waved as she carried a casserole to Jenkins' house. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Ellen said. "What does?" I asked. "This neighborhood. Us. All of it. It feels stronger." I nodded. "Because we went through something together. And instead of letting it divide us, it brought us closer." She smiled softly. "Funny, isn't it? How sometimes the hardest people in your life end up teaching you the most important lessons." I thought about that for a long moment. Karen hadn't meant to teach us anything, but she had. She'd shown us the danger of control without compassion, of rules without relationships. And in resisting her, we'd learned the power of patience, of dignity, of standing firm without shouting. That night, before bed, I stood at the window, looking across the street at Karen's darkened house. For a moment, I wondered what she was doing inside. Was she sitting alone, nursing her grudges? Or was she, even now, realizing that she couldn't shout the world into giving her love? I didn't know. Maybe I never would. But I did know this. Whatever storms came our way, Ellen and I would weather them together. And in that, there was peace. Winter crept into the neighborhood like a slow hush. The trees shed their leaves, the days grew shorter, and the evenings were marked by the scent of wood smoke curling from chimneys. Ellen always said the cold season revealed people's true hearts, whether they opened their homes with warmth or closed themselves off like locked doors. Karen, unsurprisingly, chose the latter. Her curtains stayed drawn, her yard unkempt, and though holiday decorations popped up on nearly every house, strings of lights, wreaths, inflatable Santas, hers remained bare. A few neighbors tried to extend olive branches. Mrs. Brown left a plate of cookies on her porch. Jenkins mailed her a holiday card. Both were ignored. Ellen and I kept to our traditions. We baked, we decorated. We hosted a small Christmas Eve supper for our children and grandchildren. That night, as laughter filled our home, I thought about Karen alone in hers. The image sat heavy in my chest, but I forced myself to focus on the joy in front of me. It was late that same night when we heard the knock. Loud, frantic, almost panicked. I rose from the table, thinking maybe one of the grandkids had run outside and locked themselves out. But when I opened the door, Karen stood there, pale and shivering, clutching her coat tight around her shoulders. "You have to help me," she said, her voice breaking. Behind me, the chatter in the dining room stilled. Ellen appeared at my side, her expression guarded but not unkind. "What is it, Karen?" "My heat's out," she admitted, her voice trembling. "The power company says they can't come until tomorrow. I can't stay in there. It's freezing." The silence stretched between us. My mind flashed back to her shouting. Her key jammed in our door, her voice screeching, "I live here." Yet standing there now, her bravado stripped away, she looked less like an adversary and more like what she truly was, an aging woman frightened and terribly alone. Ellen touched my arm lightly. I knew that touch. It was the one that said, "This isn't about us. This is about being human." "Come in," Ellen said softly. Karen blinked, as though she hadn't expected kindness. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes darting around as if ashamed. The warmth of our home enveloped her. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls. The sound of grandchildren giggling in the other room. For a moment, her face softened, almost wistful. We set her by the fire with a blanket. Ellen made her tea. The grandkids whispered questions, and we told them simply, "She's our neighbor, and she needs us tonight." For the next few hours, Karen sat quietly, listening more than speaking. She didn't argue, didn't scold, didn't wave authority like a banner. She just sat. Once or twice, I caught her watching the children with an expression I couldn't quite place, part sorrow, part longing. When the night ended, we made up a space for her on the couch. She protested half-heartedly, but Ellen insisted. By morning, the heat in her house had been fixed, and she left without much more than a muttered thank you. It wasn't a transformation. Not yet, but it was a crack in the armor. Weeks passed. Winter thawed into spring. Karen slipped back into her usual prickly self, though there was a shift, a small one, but noticeable. The notes under doors stopped. The shouting lessened. Once, I even caught her complimenting Mrs. Delgado's rose bushes, though she delivered it with her typical sharpness. At least someone knows how to tend a garden properly. Still, the ice was melting. Slowly. Then came the turning point. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the sirens again. But this time they weren't for us. A small crowd gathered 2 houses down, where Karen's home stood. I hurried over, Ellen at my side. An ambulance was parked in front, and 2 paramedics were guiding Karen carefully down her steps. She looked frail, smaller somehow, her face pale against the white of the stretcher blanket. "What happened?" Ellen asked a neighbor nearby. "She fell," the woman whispered, "slipped on her back porch. No one knew until she called for help." Ellen's hand gripped mine tightly. We watched as they loaded Karen into the ambulance. For all her bluster, for all her arrogance, in that moment she looked fragile as glass. The next few weeks were quiet. Karen was gone, recovering, we learned later, at a rehab center. And in her absence, something remarkable happened. The neighborhood didn't gossip or cheer. They rallied. People watered her plants, collected her mail, even fixed a broken step on her porch. She'd never do this for us. Ellen said one evening as we watered her roses. "No," I agreed, "but maybe that's not the point." When Karen finally returned, thinner but walking carefully with a cane, she seemed startled to find her home cared for, the lawn trimmed, the mailbox neat, flowers blooming. She stood in her yard a long while, staring at it all, as neighbors waved from across the street. The next day, she came to our porch. No key, no shouting, no accusations. Just Karen, holding a small plate of cookies in trembling hands. "I want to say thank you," she said awkwardly, "for Christmas, for everything." Ellen smiled warmly, taking the plate. "You're welcome, Karen." Karen shifted uncomfortably, as if in used gratitude. Then she blurted, "I don't know how to do this. Be part of things." I thought back to Jenkins' words months earlier, calm as a mirror. Maybe Karen was finally ready to face a reflection. "You start small," I said gently. "Share a meal. Say hello. Listen more than you speak. It's not about rules. It's about people." She nodded slowly, her eyes misty. For the first time, she didn't look like an enemy. She looked like a neighbor. The road ahead wasn't smooth. Old habits don't vanish overnight. But little by little, Karen changed. She joined a cookout that summer. Not running it, not barking orders. Just sitting quietly, laughing once or twice at the kids' antics. She still had her sharp edges, but they softened when she let herself be human. Ellen often said later, it wasn't us who changed her. It was kindness. The kind she couldn't demand, the kind she couldn't control, the kind freely given. And she was right. Karen had called the cops once, screaming, "I live here," as if a house could be claimed by force. But in the end, she learned what truly makes you belong. Not rules, not titles, not keys. It's kindness, it's community, it's love. Summer spread itself wide across the neighborhood. Long golden days with cicadas sang their endless song, and the air smelled of cut grass and barbecue smoke. Ellen and I spent many evenings on our porch, iced tea in hand, waving at neighbors as they walked by. What struck me most that summer was the way people seemed closer than ever. The memory of Karen's outburst, the key, the handcuffs, the shouting, hadn't been forgotten, but had transformed. It was no longer the wedge that divided us. Instead, it had become the moment that revealed what we could be when we chose patience and compassion over anger. Karen herself was proof of that change. She didn't become a different person overnight. She was still sharp-tongued, still prone to bossiness, but she softened in ways that mattered. Sometimes she lingered on the sidewalk to talk to Ellen about gardening. Sometimes she stopped by Jenkins' house to listen to one of his long, winding stories. She even brought lemonade to the kids selling cookies one afternoon, though she complained about the price being too high. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she came to our porch again. She didn't knock or demand. She just stood there a moment, her cane resting against her leg, her face uncertain. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. "Of course not," Ellen said, rising to fetch another chair. We sat there in companionable silence for a while. The sky turned orange, then pink, then that deep indigo that feels like a blanket being pulled across the world. Finally, Karen spoke. "I used to think rules were everything," she admitted quietly. "That if I kept things tight enough, strict enough, people would respect me. That's how my father was. That's how I thought it had to be." I didn't interrupt. I just let her speak. "But respect doesn't come from fear," she continued, her voice trembling. "It comes from being someone worth respecting. And I wasn't. I know that now." Her confession hung in the air like the sound of church bells. Unexpected, humbling, sacred. Ellen reached over and touched her hand lightly. "It's never too late to change, Karen. Never." Karen's eyes glistened. She nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak. After that night, something truly shifted. She began showing up more often, not to lecture, not to patrol, but to participate. She brought a pie to the next neighborhood cookout. She sat with the children during a block party and actually laughed at their silly jokes. She even apologized, awkwardly, haltingly, to a few of the neighbors she'd wronged the most. It wasn't a fairy tale transformation. She still had her moments, but there was humility in her now, and humility is the soil where kindness takes root. Months later, Jenkins passed away. The whole neighborhood turned out for his memorial service. His cane rested against the pulpit, his hat placed gently on the table beside framed photos of him through the years. People stood up one by one to share stories. How he fixed a neighbor's porch without being asked, how he taught children to fish, how he never failed to greet you with a twinkle in his eye and a bit of advice tucked in his words. When it was Karen's turn, we all held our breath. She stood slowly, her cane steadying her, and spoke in a voice softer than any of us had ever heard from her before. "Mr. Jenkins once told me that calm is a mirror," she said. "At the time, I didn't understand. I thought he was just being poetic. But I see it now. He held up a mirror to me, and I didn't like what I saw. It took me a long time to face it. But I'm grateful he cared enough to say it. And I hope, before I leave this world, I can live in a way that makes people glad I was here, the way we're all glad he was." Her words broke something open in the room. People wept openly, myself included. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. Even the hardest people can become teachers, if we're willing to listen. From then on, Karen was never quite the same. She wasn't perfect, none of us are, but she became part of the neighborhood instead of standing apart from it. She still loved her rules, but she learned to love her neighbors more. And in the end, That's what mattered. Years later, Ellen and I would sit on that same porch, watching the world change around us. And we'd remember that wild day when Karen tried to force her way into our home, shouting, "I live here." We'd laugh sometimes at the absurdity, shake our heads at the memory of her cuffing herself. But beneath the laughter, we always carried a lesson. Belonging doesn't come from force. It doesn't come from shouting the loudest or holding the biggest set of keys. Belonging comes from kindness, from patience, from showing up with open hands instead of clenched fists. Karen thought she could demand her place by controlling others, but in the end, she found her place by learning to be human with the rest of us. And as for us, we learned that sometimes the people who test our patience the most are the ones who teach us the deepest truths. As the years passed and the seasons cycled through, that neighborhood became more than just a collection of houses. It became a community. Not perfect, not without conflict, but strong in the ways that mattered. Ellen's words came back to me often. Control is just fear in disguise. And I saw how true it was, not only in Karen, but in myself, in everyone who tries to hold too tightly to things slipping through our fingers. In the end, the lesson was simple. Let go of control. Hold on to kindness. Because kindness is the real master key. It opens every door worth walking through.